So I'm Susan Nakamura. Phil is offsite. Phil and Jill are offsite. So Phil asked me to lead the meeting today. So going over the agenda on the public hearing items, we have one public hearing item for proposed rule 415. This is the odors from the rendering facilities. So I'll start and Tracy can chime in. So at the September board meeting, do you want to
Sure.
take it? Okay.
Sure. As many of you know, at the September board meeting, the governing board directed staff to essentially pick up where we left off on Rule 415 for controlling odors from rendering plants. And we did that. At the time that the rulemaking was suspended, we had already circulated our SCAQMD document. And we're in the progress of responding to comments at that time. And actually, we're getting really close to putting together our 30-day doc for the set hearing package. So since the governing board gave us that direction, we got back to the facilities, had an information meeting, met with them again since it had been a couple of years, and met with them. So what we did was we carried forward really the same basic design we had with the rendering rule, which is best management practices with control requirements. But we met with the facilities to try to see if we could help kind of deal with some of their cost concerns. So for best management practices, if there's another management practice that they think might be advantageous that can meet the same objective of one listed in the rule, they can submit for approval. If they're looking to control because one of the elements is control the receiving area, control the wastewater, and control the cooking operations. For the receiving area, we gave them an option that they don't have to vent that enclosure to an air pollution control device as long as they have a secondary containment. So it would be an enclosed building, but they would have something like not just a door, but like an air curtain, a vestibule, something an airlock that would create a secondary containment to keep the odors within the building. Because when we went to a couple of the facilities, as long as the odors were inside the building and the doors were closed, you really didn't smell anything outside. So that adds another low-cost option for the facilities. And then also, when it comes to looking at the other control requirements, working with the facilities that do vent their receiving area, we modified the control requirements to only focus on either sulfur or nitrogen compounds in lieu of doing both, which they would have to do for the wastewater and they have to do for the cooking operation. We also still retained within the rule that if they had ongoing odor issues that didn't amount to a notice of violation, but they were ongoing issues and we could register odor events over a running 6-month period, they would have to do an odor mitigation plan, which would lay out identification of the source of the odors and then actions by the facility. So in working with the facilities, it looks like we've been able to address not all, but many of their concerns. And I think we've got a good workable rule to take before the governing board.
Any comments or questions?
And this is just nuisance, nothing criteria or toxic. It's just
no. I mean, there's going to be unquantifiable emission reductions associated with it, but no, we're focusing on the others.
It's just
yes.
You said you mitigated most of their concerns. What are the outstanding concerns?
The outstanding concerns are still what's the cost going to be, and we were able to mitigate some of that with the control requirements, allowing some alternative for the receiving area or best management practices. So it doesn't totally alleviate, but it really cuts the cost down.
And one point that is mentioned in the staff report is that staff did do a survey of similar rendering facilities in urban areas in the other parts of the country, and even here in the San Joaquin Valley, found examples of facilities owned by some of the larger companies that are going to be subject of this rule that already have the type of control that we're thinking of under this rule. So we think it's pretty much the industry practice nationwide, and just this little area is kind of an exception at this point.
Particularly in areas where you have residences and communities, and and I think another really important point is Darling Ingredients, which is one of the facilities that's affected by the rule, has already implemented. They're almost close to completing their enclosure, vented pollution controls, implementing some of the best management practices that we have in the rule. So they're very close to implementing it. So in terms of, a facility being able to implement these controls and still have viable operation, it's really been demonstrated. We're not the first out of the gate in this type of rulemaking. There's New York, there's, other jurisdictions that have required very similar types of requirements, so.
I've got two questions. One is that I understand that for some of these folks who were concerned about cost, once the district did a site visit and went over it and said, no, you actually don't have to do what you think you have to do here. There was there was some real alleviation of concerns. Has there pretty much been a meeting of the minds and an understanding between folks now that we're at this late point, and is that fully or partially address those concerns?
It's like, from, my participation in this, last part of the rulemaking, so we had a meeting with two of the facilities that still had, quite a bit of work to do, or one had quite a bit of work to do, one had a little bit of work to do. And then we met separately with another one of the facilities to discuss the provisions of the rule. After we had the meeting, we went back out to two of the facilities to look specifically at the issues that they had, to see if there were things that we could do within the rule. And so we made additional modifications to the rule to address or clarify areas that they had concerns with, and to confirm whether or not we still felt that that was a problem. And so made modifications to the current rule that we're gonna bring to the board. So I think it's like it's difficult to speak on behalf of them, but generally I think what they're saying is that they're still concerned about the cost, but they feel that the rule is livable and that they can comply with the rule. So I think we feel, I don't wanna jinx it, but we feel generally okay, I guess.
Yeah, these site visits that Susan mentioned, I really feel that and then the adjustments to the ruling made really brought us a lot farther along than where we were previously. So, yeah, Susan's right. I think we're pretty good.
Great. The other question is, somebody asked me about the basis for the 4 to 6 hour time limit on holding raw, unbroken down materials versus the 1 hour limit on broken down materials. And I think I know what the answer is, but what's the basis for that difference?
Well, so the 4 to 6, the longer time is if the material is refrigerated, but that's just a temporary provision until their enclosure is built. So recognizing that they don't have the ability to quickly move product in, so we're saying until the enclosure is built, you have 4 to 6 hours to move your raw materials into your enclosure. Once your enclosure is built, we're hoping that they're not going to be tipping outside of their enclosure, but in the event that they do, they have 1 hour to move that material into the enclosure.
Right.
Okay.
And it's really their desire not to have the product and the material sitting out and rotting, because it doesn't produce a good product tallow for what their goals are. So they really want to try to move the product as quickly as possible. I think is when you see these longer time frames is when they have additional product that they're receiving because another facility is down. And we did add a provision in the rule that would allow them to accept that material, provided they provide notification, and we give them a little more time to have that product sit outside, recognizing you don't want another facility that has this excessive product building up because they're inoperable. So we know that we need to have sort of that give and take. We want this to move through the processing. The longer it sits, the worse it is.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yes.
Can you tell us all the facilities that you're working with and what they're, kind of just a very brief overview of their status, how close they are to everything, but if you can tell us all the facilities that you're.
Sure. So one facility, Coast Packing, which is the smallest of the facilities, is generally exempt from the enclosure requirements, and so they're subject to the best management practice provisions of the rule, and they'll also be subject to the contingency provision in the odor management. So they have very little to do. Darling Ingredients is a facility that has implemented most of the measures in the rule. And they've built a new enclosure, vented pollution controls. We went out to visit them, was it 2 weeks ago or a week ago?
Yeah, it's nice.
They're,
Nice up
they're, pretty much gonna be in very good shape for the proposed rule. Baker Commodities is, they probably have, Baker and D&D have the most work that needs to be done. Their raw material receiving area is currently in the open. They're gonna need to do some work to complete a closed system for their cooking operation. They need to have an enclosure for their wastewater treatment area. They have probably kind of a steeper uphill in terms of what needs to be done. D&D, they are a little more unique in terms of their operations. They have a batch operation. They accept animals that are like roadkill type animals, animals from that have been euthanized, and so they have a big uphill too. Their operation is very open. Their raw material receiving area is open. Their cooking operation is open. They have a lot of work that they're going to need to do. So those two facilities are probably the two that need to do the most work, and those are the ones where we highlight in the board presentation in terms of they bear the most amount of cost. And then the fifth facility, being Farmer John, they're pretty close in terms of the compliance with the rule. There's some modifications that will be needed, but it's a far less compared to Baker and D&D.
One question about, they're gonna bring Resurrection's gonna be a bus.
So on Monday evening, Councilman Jose Huizar hosted a meeting at Resurrection Church. Resurrection Church, they have a neighborhood meeting every Monday evening, and one of the issues that they've been discussing is proposed Rule 415. So staff went to the meeting and we highlighted the key elements of the proposed rule. We took comments, and then they were sending around a tablet for signups for folks to come to the board meeting on Friday, November 3rd.
I have one question. You mentioned that once implemented, if there is an ongoing or spike issues,
Ongoing odor issues, yeah.
how do we identify the facility when we can't identify facilities now? Regarding who's responsible for odor incidences?
Well, we're hoping that once the control requirements go on and they're implementing their best management practices and they put on the enclosures, like, when we're talking like D&D and Baker Commodities being across the street, once they get their systems enclosed and they're venting, it should be a lot easier for us to identify, even though they're across the street from each other, which facility it is. So we're hopeful they'll be able to do that. And then, of course, we're still talking about not something that gets to the amount of an NOV, but if we can have confirmed odor events over a period of time, we can use those elements of the rule to require them to do a mitigation plan.
I look at the figure in the staff report that showed where the complaints came from, and they seem to be still grouped right around the freeway. And I don't know if that's because that's where the community had organized, or whether there may be some transport issue resulting in odors.
Well, but the burning flesh, the cooking of these animal materials, it is very, very distinct.
Right.
You can tell it between a locomotive, a diesel truck, and some of these other things. I mean, you can tell the difference.
Okay.
It is very unique.
Other transport flesh,
Yeah, it can travel for a long distance.
Yeah.
It's very distinctive.
So there are some provisions in the rule, but Ron, I think you were saying that some of these odors may be coming from the trucks that are actually transporting the material for rendering. And so we have put some provisions in the rule, such as washing the trucks and clean and freeboard requirements.
Yeah.
I just found it,
Covering all the incoming trucks.
I'll go back to my statement last time. I found it interesting that so many of the complaints right along the freeway corridor. And the other one is that I want to go back to my windrows, is that most of the winds are blowing from the southwest to the northeast, and yet most of the complaints are northwest of, say, Baker, which is, I guess, the number one facility we think has a problem, and yet those odors should be going to the east, and there's virtually no complaints. That's my only.
Ron, we were at a public meeting, during the exciting issue, and in the meeting, you could smell that stench.
No, I understand. I'm just talking about Baker. I'm just talking about Baker, because I think there's, to the west, that may be more likely to be a source of an odor if you look at the windrows.
Right, but you just, sometimes the wind shifts, and just depends on how the winds are going, so.
Yeah, and across from Baker is D&D. And part of the difficulty in enforcing Rule 402 for the nuisance is we have always, the issue that we talk about of the number of complaints, but what makes this particular rule or this particular industry more challenging is not only the proximity of these facilities, but getting to an upwind location. So on the other side of Baker is a flood channel, and then you have the railroad track, so you can't get directly upwind to demonstrate that it isn't coming from another upwind source. So there's other challenges that are associated with on the 402 nuisance, but hopefully, we have a more proactive approach in the rule, establishing these requirements for the facilities, and hopefully we will be fully addressing the issue of odors from rendering.
Is the community satisfied with the rule? We have a busload of smiling people, or
The general sentiment was that they were supportive of the concepts in the rule. They just want to, I think there was a little education that we provided in regards to what a rule means in terms of the enforcement and compliance and what can happen if they don't comply. So we explained that. What you might hear at the board meeting is the issue of our 1-800-CUT smog and the outreach, and not everybody knows about the 1-800-CUT smog and response time. That was a lot of what was discussed in addition to proposed Rule 415 at that meeting.
One last question. I know you, in the staff report, they said for that 21-month period of the 190 some complaints. How many instances did we have 6 or more complaints that would traditionally trigger a potential NOV?
It wasn't very many.
No.
Yeah,
it wasn't.
and part of it also was not just the number of complaints, but also that demonstration of being able to decipher particularly which facility it was coming from, and then also getting to the upwind, demonstrating that there was not an upwind source that was impacting the
I understand
odor,
that. I
so.
understand. I just was wondering, if you had significant
Yeah, I was,
incidents.
I wanna say a very small handful, yeah. But we know that it's a problem. We've been out there, we've been to public meetings, we've heard about it. I think the board members, you've heard about it, yeah.
Do we anticipate more odor rules coming down the pike?
So Rule 1430, which was the grinding rule at metal forging facilities, had an odor element to it. And then we had previously a Rule 410 for material recovery facilities. And then we do want to go back and revisit our Rule 402 and possibly create a new 402.1 that may look specifically at odors in terms of the number of complaints and the demonstration, and because we know this is an issue, and any way that we can try to be a little more proactive is what we want to try to do.
And I saw 416 on the rule forecast, but I forget what it was.
416 is TBD on the that was the grease rule.
Okay.
And it'll, with everything we need to do with 617, will probably still be a TBD for next year.
The
We're putting together the new
grease
mold.
processing is different from rendering,
Yes.
but similar.
It's like still stinky.
Yeah, gotcha, okay.
Okay, so then I'm gonna move to the set hearing items on page 2. So we have 3 set hearing items for the December board meeting. Rule 11, proposed Rule 1180.
Sure, so this is our fence site monitoring rule. As you know, this originally started out as bedside and community monitoring, however, because of the passage of AB 1647, then that basically dictated the air districts to not only come up with a designing, developing, and operating and maintaining the community plan, it requires the refineries for financing that operation. So we cut out all the requirements under the community from the rule, and have left it just as far as fence line is concerned. This particular rule isn't really designed to be too prescriptive. It requires actually a compliance plan from each of the refineries to tell us what's the most adequate coverage for their fence line area. The last sort of remaining element that we're sort of working with on with the stakeholders is really just about the fee schedule, basically how much we would be charging the refineries for the capital cost to install the community monitoring system, and then the annual operating cost. Our thought is to bifurcate this into separating the actual upfront capital cost into the rule. We think the board would be interested in knowing that that's been codified and set in motion, and then separating out the annual operating and maintenance fees into our 301. That way it allows for every year continual, up of that fee, because that's what's going to happen when they continue on operating and maintaining that community system. So we're going to send out some of our latest stuff actually this morning. It's coming right now to our stakeholders to get their latest feedback, so we're ready to go for our 30-day window next week.
Any comments?
Thank you very much.
So we're also setting a public hearing, which we had set last month. So we had briefed you on proposed amendment rule 1420. This is the third of the series of 1420 lead rules that we'll be proposing. This is really the last of the umbrella rules for emission standards for lead. We have the large lead acid battery recycling facilities, large melting facilities in 1420.2. Establishes a similar ambient standard of 0.1 micrograms per cubic meter. Requires that they have enclosures, but the enclosures are not ventilated pollution controls. Requires point source requirements that are similar to the 1420.1 and 0.2 rules, and then has an on-ramp for monitoring if there is non-compliance with the emission standard for the point source requirements, or if we were to monitor and we find the exceedance of the ambient requirement that we have established in the rule. Any comments or questions?
Oh, yes. This is on, you have no minimum, or no minimum threshold in regard to lead. It says less than 2 tons processed, and more than 2 tons processed. And I suspect that the less than 2 tons have an extremely small amount. And wouldn't there be an exemption at some level?
Yeah, if they're less than 2 tons and less than 0.05% lead, then they're excused from the rule. So those facilities that are 0.05%, less than 2 tons and 0.05, greater than 0.05, then they have to do the housekeeping provisions.
Greater than 0.05.
0.05% lead content in the metals that they're using. So the concern is that if you had, greater than 2 tons, but we don't put any threshold in terms of the percentage of lead that's processed, that you could have a source that could potentially, be a fairly large source in terms of the amount of lead associated with the lead content. So we added the 0.05%. There was previously a lead content provision of 0.5%.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
How many facilities might be affected?
The total number of facilities that are going to be subject to like the core requirements, point source requirements, I think it's about 15. And then the bulk of the other facilities, I want to say there are about 80 of those that are going to be subject to the housekeeping provisions, being sure that they're conducting their lead operations within the enclosure, and then the contingency measures for monitoring.
4 of those larger ones report no lead when they do their emission. When they report their emissions, they may at one time done lead, but they're not reporting lead.
Yeah, there's a provision in the rule that allows a facility that if they've modified their operations and they're now lead-free, that they could be exempt from the rule. So we did add a provision. It's similar to a provision that we have in 1420.2 also.
Did you say the enclosures are not vented to an air pollution control
Right.
device?
Yeah.
And why is that?
Because these are the smaller lead sources in terms of the amount that they're melting, and then the type of melting that they're doing. We're not talking about, you know, big blast furnaces and electric arc furnaces. Many of these are, you know, smaller. We have another companion rule that's coming, which is Rule 1407, that will capture other sources that, so they may be facilities that are subject to 1420 in terms of the housekeeping, but they have other metals of concern, nickel, cadmium, arsenic, hexavalent chrome, and they may be looking at some additional requirements for those sources. But you know, we're talking about facilities from lead soldering to small melting kettles, and it having vending those to pollution controls, the direct controls. Doing that within a building, we feel is sufficient, and we still have the ambient requirement that will capture if there's a concern for anything that might be escaping the enclosure.
Okay, so I don't need to worry about what the worst case exposure off-site is going to be, because you've got that monitoring requirement.
Yeah.
That should address that.
Right, yeah, so the monitoring requirement though is it's an on-ramp, it's not a mandatory requirement. So 1420.1 and 2 have that as a mandatory requirement, but if we suspect a facility, we can start monitoring at that facility. If they're over the 0.115, we would then require, they would have that on-ramp to start monitoring.
Okay, I thought there was an on-ramp there, but yeah, when you just said no air pollution control device, I thought I better ask.
Well,
Yeah.
Chemetical is probably your largest lead emission producer.
Right.
And I'm going to assume that in the 2016 air quality card, where they talked about special monitoring nearest the these facilities, and that the highest one was 0.06. And I'm assuming that's from Chemetical, which did 25 tons. Most of these facilities are doing less than 2 pounds.
Look at the level of control.
Not 25, but 25 pounds. Now, I assume that facilities that are doing, and this is the major ones that do report, are doing less than 2 pounds. That they're, I even question why we have this rule, but based on the fact that the ambient level is 90% below the federal standard in the true ambient monitors. But there shouldn't be any concern about these guys coming even close to the chemical emissions with 2 pounds or less.
I think the jury's out on that, and we're gonna be seeing very soon what that looks like. 1420.2 does have a mandatory lead monitoring provision in it. The monitors are just getting up and going for those facilities, and so we'll be collecting monitoring data for those facilities on the lead. So Chemetical is a very well-controlled facility. If you look at their point source controls, everything's been into pollution controls that are under negative air. The buildings are vented to pollution controls. So compared to, you know, another facility that may not be, that have that same requirement.
My only point is, of the 15 facilities you've identified, 4 are not reporting any lead, and the ones that do report lead, the other, you know, half of them don't even report any emissions. Now, the ones that do report lead come in at 1.3, 1.4 pounds per year.
Yeah,
So I don't think there's.
We need to just be careful on looking at that data. One of the things that we want to do in the next round of amendments to Reg 3 is it's how we bring in facilities that are emitting toxics and they're reporting to us. Because generally we identify these facilities based on their criteria pollutants, but if their criteria pollutants are under 4 tons, they may not have been captured in our annual emissions collection and reporting of emissions data. So we're finding this as we go through the toxics rules, that there's a number of facilities that are clearly emitting toxic air contaminants, but they're not captured in our reporting, so.
Okay.
So next item for December is Rule 1466, proposed rule, or Rule 1466 was brought to the board in July, and the board, when the board adopted Rule 1466, There was a request for staff to return to the board to expand the list of toxic air contaminants. We're gonna be returning to the board to expand the list of toxic air contaminants based on the list of tax that the board had recommended. And we're also going to expand a little bit on the applicability. We found that in the designation of these sites that have toxic air contaminants in the soil, that they can, agencies as well as the facility can designate to a city, fire, or other local health agency. Because we're just identifying EPA, DTSC, and the Regional and State Water Quality Board, we found that that could potentially be a loophole in terms of applicability. So we're also identifying that if it's also designated or the oversight of a local air agency or health agency, that they would also be subject to the rule. The rule also adds some additional notification provisions. So if they were to change extend the amount of time that they're working on the site, that they have to notify us, so we don't send compliance staff out and either the site is not doing their operations or they've extended it and we weren't aware of it. Any comments or questions?
At the workshop, one of the workshops, you got some feedback from some contractors who bid on these things, and there was some concern about the way it's set up results in those folks that are diligent actually being cut out of getting contracts because they get underbid by those that are actually not intending on doing anything related to this role. Have you given any thought to some of those concerns and if there's anything that can be done to address that, or if that even is a legitimate issue?
Well, one thing that they could do is if they're aware of somebody carrying out work that should be subject to the rule and isn't, they certainly should let our enforcement staff know. So, you know, it's definitely not our intention to create inequity between the contractors, but if the inequity results from some people violating a rule, I think the remedy is to prosecute them for violating the rule, not to make the rule less stringent.
Of course, that's after the fact.
Sure.
And then also expecting somebody to turn somebody else in doesn't always work as well as you might like it to.
Hopefully, as we progress through implementing 1466 and as our compliance staff enforces it, that the word will get out that this is that we're serious about this, and that if you're going to be conducting earth moving activities with these soils that contain toxic air contaminants, that you're going to need to adhere to the rules. So we've been working closely with compliance and looking at the sites, working with facilities, and so. Hopefully we can get the word out. We're also thinking of putting together a brochure that would also communicate to all the stakeholders and folks. We've been thinking about this in the rules where like all the rules that are coming through is having these brochures that will kind of a quick index for folks to know what to be aware of. So.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know, Matt. Are you familiar with number 3? It's on Mates 5. Okay. So I don't know a lot about this, and hopefully Matt can help to fill in a little bit. But so as part of Mates 5, we're working to set up a number of different monitoring and some sensors. There's a contract. There's a number of contracts that we're looking at and RFPs. I don't know, Matt, if you can add to it.
Yeah, so some of the fence line monitoring, optical remote sensing technologies that we've been investigating, we want to go ahead and do an RFP to purchase those because there's enough promise there where we think we can get some near real-time information like we were seeing in our demonstration project. So one of them is looking at solar occultation flux, where that van that drove around refineries, and they could tell the flux that's coming into across the fence line. So that's one technology. There was also part of it was to look at flight data, so you would have airplanes that would go over the refineries and be able to collect information in much more detail than we could do if we were just doing these remote fence line monitoring. And then another portion is to use low-cost sensor work that we've developed with AQ-SPEC to also get information about the near kind of fence line and community exposures. So a lot of it, so essentially it's a lot of the work that we've been gearing up for under our advanced technologies to put it in practice and see if there's information to be gained through our MATES program.
Any questions, comments?
You expect Mates 5 to come out? I mean, I imagine it's gotta be a ton of work.
So the working group meetings have started, there's been a couple, and we've been working, through the process and just getting it up and going.
So next year,
I
2019?
think we're starting in 2018, and it's planned to go for a full year.
Probably sometime in 2019 figure.
So June 2019 is the expected end date.
Oh, okay.
And it's all the processing and the information and then putting it in a usable format, so that'll take a while. So I wouldn't expect to see a report until, probably early 2020, maybe.
Oh, okay. When was Mates 4? How long ago was it?
2012.
2015 was the final report.
2015?
Just a comment. Matt, at the CalSTART conference, which you attended yesterday, but not the day before, there was a session on electric power airplanes. And these evidently are not just a pipe dream, and it's quite surprising to me anyway. But their greatest utility is in short distances, like less than 100 miles. Because to go much farther than that, you need a lot of batteries, which take up what would otherwise be cargo space or passenger space. But it seems to me for air monitoring over these refineries and so on, use of such aircraft might be an ideal opportunity for AQMD, and also enable AQMD to support this new technology that's coming on scene. So I realize maybe it can't be done immediately, but I toss that out as a prospect that might be worth taking a look at in the next couple of years.
So in fact, the reason that Jason and Andrea and our monitoring staff aren't here is because they're at UC Riverside talking to the professors there who have developed a program to look at drones and sensors. So we're at Dr. Bert's behest, we are looking very seriously at how to deploy those and use low-cost sensors with drone technology to do that.
Great.
It's not really a nice thing, but in the old days, ancient days of the district, we had a chairman who loved balloon travel across.
Wait, there was a chairman before Dr. Burke?
There were
some of us on our own list. There was several.
But one of the reasons that I think they called it Atmosat is that they took the balloon up and they went on a reversal of air during a heavy polluted, just to see what was in the upper air. Have we ever thought about that? Probably not part of the MATES program, but maybe in regard to seeing, I don't know, toxics.
So that was probably looking at plume
Right.
height and what the
See,
emissions are.
Well, also to see what was,
And so there's been a couple of projects that we're looking at, working with, the board approved a project to work with NASA to look at satellite data and how to define a resolution by correlating to on and ground sensors. That was just approved last month. The project that the board is going to hear on this MATES project is actually looking at overflights using Aerospace Corporation to do what you're similarly, rather than using balloons, we're just doing aircraft flights and do the same thing.
Which is where he used to work for them.
Hi, Chairman?
Yeah.
But, he's still around, so maybe.
Is he? Yeah. Sorry to hear that.
Poor Tom.
Okay, so number 4 is Matt,
Okay, so the item 4 is a JIRA award that we won, it's about $1 million, and we have proposed to do truck replacement projects, but the novel aspect of this project is we are looking at a 3-way trade. So rather than destroy the engine, if it's a 2012 truck, it's still fairly new, so that could be deployed outside of our basin in a non-extreme attainment area. So we're working with the West Coast Collaborative, and in particular, Puget Sound, to do that trade. So they would find older trucks for us to scrap, and then we would sell them the 2012, our newer truck up in Puget Sound, but then we would get the brand new truck here. So it's a way to make it more economical for the end user. And we'll see if we can actually broker that, because it is a bit of a logistics challenge is to do this three-way trade. So it's been proposed before, but never been successfully done here. So this will be a model to see if we can implement that. So that's recognizing just over $1 million to implement that project.
I've got one question about that one. Will there be a provision in the agreement that would prevent those really dirty trucks that we send out of state from ever coming into the state?
We're working with Puget Sound, so we can probably put that into the contract where that if we're gonna sell you this 2012 truck, you have to make sure it stays within your region and not come back down the south coast.
And this would be, we were gonna get the .02
We're getting the .02 grams
trucks.
Okay, number 5.
The next item is number 5. So as you recall, the catenary project down in the city of Carson, this was an award to Siemens. It was a very large scale project, many funding partners, and it's taken quite a while to implement. We're actually testing the trucks now, even though it started in 2013. During the course of the construction, they ran into several unforeseen challenges, the biggest of which was there was an unidentified gas pipeline along the median on Alameda Street that no one knew what was, no one claimed any ownership of it, so they couldn't disturb it because it's unknown what was in it. That forced them to change the construction from a below ground to an above ground support for the catenary wires. Because of that and delays in permitting and the new safety requirements that Carson then put on the company, they incurred well over $1 million of delayed and reconstruction and redesign costs. So they've asked us if we could help them with some of that delay, and so we're recommending to the board that we help pay for some of those unforeseen costs, about $400,000 for the safety barriers that Carson required them to put on the system. So if you go down the Alameda Street in Carson, you'll see these gigantic 5-foot by 10-foot blocks of concrete along the median. And Carson required them to put K-rails and guardrails around those blocks to prevent traffic accidents. And so there's an unforeseen cost that we feel that we should pay for that. So that's what this report is for.
Any questions?
Who's gonna, how's it working? How the trucks perform? How's it going?
They are performing well as anticipated. It's much different from what we hear from the drivers than the test track in Germany, which we recently just visited with Dr. Burke and Dr. Parker and Gordon Mitchell. And the reason being, one, in Europe, the wires on the right-hand side of the road. Ours is on the left-hand side, so that's different for the drivers to get used to. And also the tolerances here, because it's a very narrow road in Alameda. They said it is, you have to be very careful on making sure you're aligned with the wires. But we're in the process of collecting data.
Is there any battery on the truck? Or so
the intent is
because they have to come off the catenary at some point.
So there's 3 architectures: full battery electric, natural gas range extended, which has a battery, and then diesel electric. And I can't recall if the Volvo has a battery.
It does,
10-mile all electric range. And the intent there is that they could charge on the catenary if it's a long range, and then they can be all electric in certain areas. So if they're in the warehousing or in the ports, they can run on battery, and then when they need to recharge, they can get back on the catenary, or they can go off outside of our region and run the engine to recharge the battery. So any questions on that?
So Matt, the city of Carson had no idea the underground through the pipeline, but it was active.
No one took credit for it, right? So we asked refineries, SoCal Gas, Air Products. It's a mystery pipe.
Should have been built in LA. Such as all of our funding, but
Make a pinhole in it and test
Then the barriers, so I drove by and I took a look at it, and your footings are massive, so the barriers, the K-rails to protect a truck from hitting the massive base and toppling over, because it's not in the ground, so it's not secured to the ground.
I think it is bolted in the
It is
ground.
bolted, okay. So there's some depth
They-
of,
Yeah, oh yeah, it's
Okay.
secured. But yeah, they required over $600,000 worth of safety improvements. And on top of the redesign, the delays, it's been a huge deficit in the projects, the budget. The next item, number 6, is to replace diesel school buses with electric school buses. We won a previous DERA, Diesel Emission Reduction Act, award from the EPA. We proposed to do 4 electric school buses, 2 with LAUSD, 2 with Colton Joint Unified. Unfortunately, LAUSD has come back and said they don't currently have the funding to do the cost share requirements in this year's budget. And so we're proposing to move those 2 to Colton, who is going to do the additional 2. And we would come back to LAUSD and see if there's other projects that we can do school buses in the next fiscal year.
What happens to those diesel school buses?
What happens to those? We scrap those.
Wait, only because I spent a lovely week up in Navajo country and I saw some of the school buses up there. There's no thought of sending those, because you don't have the concern about trucks, coming into the area. You're taking those school buses and finding poor areas of the country that need school buses.
Yeah, so with the same idea that we pitched in the DERA project for the truck replacements, we could also look into, are there school districts or others that could use the buses? We don't want to go, we want to make sure that they would be cleaner than what they're already running, obviously.
Well, on the Navajo reservation, I can guarantee they're clean.
Well, we'll look into that.
No.
So one point is, as Matt said, this is a novel provision of the other one with the freeway with Puget Sound. And that's actually, interestingly enough, one of the things we asked in our petition for the ultra low NOx standard was that they also consider allowing that kind of a use of the trucks. And so they've been receptive to that, which is good.
I think it's a good idea.
Matt, the extra money, so is Colton upping the amount of buses that replace them to electric, so the additional money you're requesting is to accommodate additional replacement buses, or are we covering more of the cost for Colton
No.
than we were
They
for
would take
LUSD?
the 2 that we're gonna go to LA Unified and do, so instead of doing 2, they would do 4. So we're not,
Gotcha.
we're not replacing funding, we're just doing the same deployment with Colton. And just to put your mind at ease, it's not that LA Unified doesn't wanna do it, they just don't have the budget this year. And we think that we could potentially give them more funding under a LADWP settlement. So you may recall that when they were gonna run diesel in the generators to make up for the Aliso Canyon, they gave us some settlement funds. And part of that was for doing electric buses, so we're gonna look to that fund as opposed to the DERA funds to do electric school buses in LA Unified territory.
I think Colton was the first school district to go all CNG.
Right.
So Supervisor Gonzalez, who previously sat on the board, her chief of staff is on the school board. Someone who gave electric school buses to Montana, I gave him a bad time, so that Montana was getting cleaner than Colton, so
Right.
he's very excited about this.
Good.
He's a really good guy.
Any other questions? Good, okay. Item 7, this is just a kind of a routine item under our Moyer program. So we went solicitations for Moyer and soon, which is the opt-in for low NOx off-road equipment. We were oversubscribed, which is a good sign that there are many projects out there, and there's mostly due to change in lines. And so we're requesting to fund our full amount of $27 million for Carl Moyer and soon. And then there's also an oversubscription of about $51 million, and contingent upon AIRB giving us our funds under the AB 617 community monitoring and replacement programs. We would recommend that we would use that as a backup list for that program to spend that money quickly. But it's currently, we don't have that funding, and ARB has not provided those revenues, and so we're simply going to the board to say, let's fund the projects that we have under SUNY and water.
So that board letter might be a little bit late because we have to put in provisions to make sure that we do end up complying with whatever CARB requires for the expenditure of incentive fundings that were awarded in order to implement AB 617 in one of the budget bills, which is mentioned here, AB 134. So we don't want to commit to spending the money for one purpose and then find out that CARB wants it to be. So we have to draft the board letter to make sure we're not going to be committed to something that we then later have to change. So it might be a little delayed.
Any questions on that one? Okay, item 8, the next one is main contracts for Tier 4 passenger locomotives. So you might recall, we've come to the board at least two times, where Metrolink had requested us to replace over 40 locomotives to do Tier 4s. And we decided that rather than granting this very large request, we would do it in chunks. And so this is one of the chunks that we're coming back to the board to do another tranche of Tier 4 locomotives. So this one is for $9 million. The total ask, I think, was over 109 or 50 million.
58.
Yeah, and so this is just one in the series. We'll probably come back to the board another 2 times to make up the full funding request.
Those
Yeah.
are all Tier 0s, right? Metrolink has been running those things for,
Yeah.
since they started in the early
They're
90s.
replacing with Tier 4.
I know, but there were Tier 0s and
One and two, depending on which
Tier
one.
2s.
They were like one of the same locomotives
But they're,
from when they started back in the early 90s or something.
they're old.
Yeah, I have a couple questions on this topic here. First of all, I noticed that it's to replace 17 and purchase 3 new. If I remember correctly from the technology committee discussion, AQMD's monies will be spent in the purchase of replacements as opposed to the new. And perhaps you could explain why the distinction is there. It could be that replacement means you're actually making a noticeable reduction in emissions. And secondly, it seems to me that cumulatively AQMD has already given over 110, close to over 100 million, close to 109 million, maybe something like that. And maybe that must be from previous funds. And I'm wondering if you could refresh our memory as to where those previous funds are coming from, if you recall offhand. If not, that's fine.
I'm sorry. My understanding is they have 17 Tier 0s that we're replacing, and they're
Right.
adding 3.
Right.
So we're not replacing the 3 additional ones, right? So they're adding to the fleet.
Right, I understand. So, but the discussion at Technology Committee, I think, was that the AQMD funds would go towards replacing the 17,
Right.
but would not be allocated to purchasing
Right.
the 3 new ones. So I was wondering what the distinction was as to why AQMD would, maybe it's
Sure.
kind of a trivial point.
Can I take a shot and correct me if I'm wrong? I think under the Carl Moyer program, you have to do replacement, right? You can't add,
Okay.
you can't do fleet expansion. You have to just do replacements.
Okay, so that must be kind of relate to the fact that the other 100 million that's already been sent over from AQMD came from a different source, which I don't recall. I mean, it's in past board lawyers, but I don't recall. Maybe somebody else.
Yeah, for this 40 locomotive project, we're using all AB 923 funds, and the requirement of those funds is they follow the Carl Moyer guideline requirements, the criteria within Carl Moyer. So for this program at Metro, the Southern California Rail Authority, it's all AB 923 funding that we're using.
Okay, I understand that, but I'm also under the impression that previously AQMD had granted over 100 million towards, I guess, maybe new Tier 4 locomotives.
I think in Matt's original comment, when we gave money in chunks, I think this is another chunk, so I guess he's asking, what's the previous chunk and where did that come from?
Yeah, so the previous, I'm looking at the summary table on the board package. It was, the original was in February of 2013 where we provided 35 million. I think there was a special board meeting because it says February 7th of the next year, in 2014, we provided 17 million. In September of 2015, we came back with a request for 23 million, and then December 2nd, 2016 was 9 million. So this is the, so they have come to us, so they came to us two times. One was for 52 million, and we couldn't do it all at one shot, that's why we broke it up.
Right.
And the second request was for 59 million, and so we did one shot at 23, 9, and then we're gonna do 9 this time and try to come back again to do the remaining.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is our AB 923 funds are replenished monthly,
Yes.
right? So we wait for that fund to accrue enough where we can then do a large award.
Okay, well, adding what you said to what's on the board letter here, that goes to over 110, over 100 million. Okay, thank you.
Aside from replacing the locomotives in their fleet, as they add new locomotives, is the district looking at possibly doing some demos or other types of projects with them to implement zero emission technologies?
Or near zero. So yes, so as part of the original agreement is they would give us the chassis to work with if we had a vendor that could take it and develop a new technology. So we're actually applying, or did apply for, was it targeted airship grant funds? To look at some hybrid locomotive technology.
Okay, because I know there's some fuel cell projects out elsewhere. I think there's some battery electric.
Right. So we also applied, was it, might have been on the ARB, the off-road GGF funds. So we were soliciting proposals for locomotive technologies, and we did apply, but again, it was sort of near zero. And, but as you know, in working with the technology providers, you want to get in with the big suppliers to help them move their product line. And so we actually had a proposal from GE and BNSF that didn't go anywhere. So we're trying to pursue that because GE is large locomotive manufacturers and BN is big class 1. So if we can get something with them, that would be ideal. So we're continuing to work on that.
Their locomotive section is significantly challenged these days.
Who's GE?
GE's.
Have you looked at the hydrogen locomotive work that's being done in Europe? I don't know
Not,
what would be applicable at this point.
yeah, not lately, but again, we've been looking at passenger locomotives and switchers because we have willing participants. As we start going into freight, we need to work with GE and others, but we co-sponsored a project UCI to look at fuel cell locomotive technology, and ARB co-funded that with us. So we're continuing to keep our eyes open for opportunities.
Okay, great. It would be good to get them away from diesel for expansions of their fleet.
Matt, if I could mention, one of the things we've been working with, with Metrolink as they're looking at their central maintenance facility is also the ability to turn off the engines so that they don't have to run their auxiliary power through the engine. They can plug in while they're at the station while they're doing maintenance. So they've been doing some work on that too. It's limited application, but.
That's great because we've gotten lots of complaints from the folks around those facilities.
Okay.
What's a new locomotive cost? Just out of curiosity.
A lot of money.
I kind of figured.
Plus or minus.
12 million per.
More than your train set cost.
Yeah.
I'll find that, we can find out.
That's all right,
Yes.
just curious.
So number 9, right to breathe. Sam? Is that video? Or not
Sure,
Sam?
you want to handle this or would you like me to? I'll take it. So this is This is to amend a contract to actually extend the contract with Google for the Right to Breathe video. We got a credit from Google. We found out that they were not targeting the geographic areas that we had asked them to target, so they gave us a full refund plus some because it actually went into another contract. So we got $276,000 refund from them. This is just to extend the contract and to utilize this money for the upcoming revised Right to Breathe video.
Has the video been updated?
We're in the process. I just heard the sound version today, and we're updating it. It should be done sometime in November.
Is it gonna feature you?
Oh, thank God.
We all say that.
Starring Derek.
Oh, please. So, any other questions on that? Okay, so, item number 10, Matt, I think, do you wanna take that one?
Yeah, this is a simple one, is we received funding from the US government to do, to fund our enhanced protective monitoring program to the tune of about, I think it was $2 million, $2.1 million. That fully funds the program. However, with the recent spate of retirements, we actually need to just transfer money from our salaries to temporary services so we can hide temps in the interim until we hire more staff. So that's what the $180,000 transfer is for.
Any questions? Number 11, procurement policies, Mike?
So this item stems from the RFP that was put out a couple months ago for legislative services. I think Dr. Liu brought up the question of, you know, why would we offer additional procurement points for legislative services that aren't going to be provided within the district? We offer points if you're a proposer who does 90% of your business within the district. And so from a practical matter, you know, when Derek would receive the proposals, if somebody did certify that they were going to perform 90% of legislative activities within the district, he probably wouldn't recommend them for selection because obviously they probably need to be in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. But you know, to satisfy the board members' concern, we've made it explicit in the policy that legislative activities that are expected to be performed in Sacramento or in D.C. Are explicitly not qualified to receive any preference points for that purpose. But just so there was some comfort, nobody's made that assertion in the past that they were going to perform legislative services within the district. And if they did, Derek would know not to question that. They probably wouldn't get many points anyways. So, but we made the fix.
Any questions, comments? So, anything else on page 6? Page 7? Page 8? And then the top of page 9. So, I don't think we have any one for public comments. So, I think we're done. Have a good lunch, everyone.
I know.